My wife spent 3 years climbing the corporate ladder with the help of a silent investment I had made in her company before she ever worked there. She didn't know about the investment. She didn't know I was still in it. And on the Thursday afternoon, she handed me divorce papers with a smile on her face. She still didn't know. She would find out, just not on her timeline. She slid the divorce papers across the coffee table on a Thursday afternoon in March, and she was smiling when she did it. Not a cruel smile exactly, but the particular smile of someone who has rehearsed a moment and believes the rehearsal has been thorough. She had dressed for it. She had prepared a speech. The speech covered how far she had come, how much she had accomplished, how the person she was now required more than the person our marriage had become. She said, "We've grown in different directions," which is the kind of language that sounds like maturity and functions like a blade. She said she hoped I would understand. I looked at the papers. I looked at her. I said, "I'll need some time to look these over." She said, of course, that her attorney would be in touch, that she wanted this to be civil. Then she left. She had a dinner meeting, she said, with the leadership team from her company. She was a vice president now. She had important things to attend to. I sat in our living room after she left and held the papers and looked out of the window at the street for a long time. And then I picked up my phone and called a man named Howard, who was my attorney and had been for 11 years, and I told him I needed an appointment. He asked what kind. I said, corporate and family simultaneously. He said he'd clear the morning. What Nicole did not know, what she had no way of knowing because I had never told her and had never had reason to, was that 18 months before she had been hired at Meridian Strategy Group, I had made a private equity investment in the firm through a holding company I owned. The investment had been made through channels that maintained investor anonymity, which was standard for the fund structure the firm had used in its early capitalization round. My name appeared nowhere on any documents that Nicole or her colleagues would have access to. I owned, through that holding company, 40% of the firm that had just made my wife a vice president, the firm whose leadership dinner she was attending, the evening she served me with divorce papers. This is the story of what happened next. I want to tell it carefully because the satisfaction in it is real, but it is also, in the telling, inseparable from the grief. And I think the grief matters as much as the satisfaction, even if it makes for a more complicated story than the one most people want to hear. My name is Nathan. I'm 41 years old, and I worked in private equity. Specifically, I spent 12 years as a managing partner at a mid-size fund focused on professional services firms, consulting companies, staffing agencies, boutique strategy, and advisory shops. It is not a glamorous sector, but it is a lucrative one for people who are patient and precise, and I am both of those things by training and temperament. Nicole and I met when I was 31 and she was 29. She was working in management consulting at a larger firm at the time. Smart, ambitious, analytically sharp in a way that I found immediately attractive. We married 2 years later. She was, in those early years, someone I was genuinely proud to be with. Not in a possessive way, but in the way you are proud of someone whose capabilities you respect and whose direction you believe in. The investment in Meridian Strategy Group happened in the 3rd year of our marriage. 2 years before Nicole would ever hear of the firm. Meridian was one of about a dozen companies my fund evaluated in that cycle. A boutique strategy consultancy out of Atlanta that had a strong client base, a differentiated methodology, and founding partners who were technically excellent but operationally undercapitalized. We invested through our standard blind fund structure, which meant that Meridian's founders and employees had no visibility into the identities of individual investors. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, the entire design of the structure. 2 years later, Nicole was recruited to Meridian by a headhunter. She came home excited, told me about the opportunity, asked what I thought. I told her it sounded like a good move. The firm had a strong reputation in the market, I said, which was true, and which was also the most minimal version of what I knew about it. I did not tell her about the investment. There was no legal requirement for me to do so. It was a passive investment, fully anonymized, with no operational involvement on my part. I told myself it was a non-issue. Looking back, I understand that this was a rationalization and that the right thing would have been to tell her. I didn't. That's on me, and I am not pretending otherwise. Nicole thrived at Meridian. She was made a senior manager in 14 months, faster than anyone in the firm's history, her colleagues told her, and then told her again at her promotion dinner. She was made a director 2 years after that. 6 months ago, she was elevated to vice president, which put her in the top 5 of the firm's leadership structure and came with equity in the company. Equity that, because of how Meridian was now structured after 2 additional funding rounds, sat below the waterline of my original investment. I watched her career at Meridian with a particular and complicated mixture of pride and unease. Pride because she had earned every step of it. Her results were real, her clients loved her colleagues respected her, and none of that was anything I had manufactured. The unease because I understood, in a way she didn't, that the firm's ability to invest in the talent pipeline that had attracted and developed her had been partially funded by capital I had provided. The relationship was indirect, but it was real. I had never found the right moment to explain it. And then there was no longer a moment to find. The marriage had been declining for 2 years before the Thursday with the papers. I want to be honest about this because I think it would be unfair to tell this story in a way that positions Nicole as simply a villain who grew too ambitious for her own good. The truth is more textured than that. When Nicole became a director, her travel schedule increased substantially. This was expected and was, in the short term, manageable. I worked from home frequently, had flexibility in my schedule, and had no children whose routine needed protecting. What became less manageable over the following year was the way the distance that the travel created never quite closed when she came back. She returned from trips different in some incremental way each time, more certain of something, more impatient with something else, and the person I was at home didn't seem to fit neatly into the picture of her life that she was constructing with increasing clarity. We tried a couples therapist for 4 months, which helped us articulate the problems with great precision and resolve none of them. We had conversations that were honest and exhausting, and that left us knowing each other's positions better while closing the gap between them not at all. She wanted a version of her life that was larger than what we had. I wanted a version of the life we had that was more present and more shared. These were not incompatible desires on paper, but in practice, they produced a marriage that was increasingly characterized by parallel operation. 2 people moving through the same house on different tracks, touching at meals and on weekends, and less frequently than either of us admitted. The vice president promotion happened, and with it something shifted more completely. I watched it happen over about 3 months. A new quality to how she held herself, a new vocabulary in how she talked about her work, a new way of assessing the world around her that included, I felt, a new assessment of me. I am not saying she became a bad person. I am saying she became someone who had decided, at some point during those 3 months, that the version of her future that she wanted did not have room for the version of me that currently existed. I did not know she had been talking to a divorce attorney for 6 weeks before the Thursday with the papers. I learned this afterward from the filing records. She had been deliberate about the timing. She had waited until a quarter-end bonus had landed, until the equity vesting schedule was in a favorable position, until she had a clear sense of what the financial picture of the divorce would look like for her. She had done her homework. She had prepared thoroughly. And she had, as I said, dressed for it. My meeting with Howard the next morning lasted 3 hours. He listened to the whole situation, asked clarifying questions, and then sat quietly for a moment before he said, "You understand what you have here?" I said I did. He said, "I want to make sure we're on the same page about what using it means." I said I wanted to know my options before I decided anything. He said that was wise. We spent the rest of the morning laying out the options. The options, as Howard explained them, were essentially 3. Option 1, proceed with the divorce as a standard marital dissolution, dividing the marital estate equitably, making no reference to the Meridian investment. In this scenario, my 40% ownership of the firm would be a separate asset, held in a corporate structure predating the marriage and maintained independently, and would likely be treated as such in the settlement. Nicole would receive her share of our marital assets. I would retain the investment, and we would be done. Howard noted that this was the cleanest option and the one that would conclude most quickly. Option 2, disclose the investment formally to Nicole's legal team during the discovery process, which would be required if the investment had any bearing on the marital estate, which Howard believed it did not structurally. but which Nicole's attorneys might contest depending on how aggressive they wanted to be. This option would surface the relationship between my investment and her employer and would require both legal teams to assess what, if anything, it meant for the settlement. Option 3 was the one I had been thinking about since the Thursday evening, sitting in the living room after Nicole left for her dinner. It required Howard to make a call to Meridian's board of directors, a board on which my fund held a seat, through a representative who had always attended in my stead, to flag a potential conflict of interest that had recently become relevant. The specific conflict: a significant investor in the firm was involved in active divorce proceedings with a senior equity holding executive of the firm, and the investor wished to ensure that the board was aware and that appropriate governance protocols were followed. Howard asked me what outcome I was hoping for with option 3. I told him honestly I wasn't sure. I knew what it would do. It would surface my ownership to Meridian's leadership for the first time, and it would do so in a context that made the relationship between me and Nicole impossible to continue without acknowledgement and management. What I didn't know yet was whether I wanted to use it as leverage or simply as disclosure, or something in between. Howard said, "Let me tell you what will happen when Meridian's board receives that call." I said, "Go ahead." He said that the firm's operating agreement, which he had reviewed, required that any board member flagging an active conflict involving a senior executive trigger a mandatory governance review. The review would involve the firm's general counsel and its 2 independent directors. Nicole would be notified as part of the process. The notification would not initially specify what the conflict was, only that one existed and that she was involved. She would spend some number of hours, days possibly, not knowing what was coming before it arrived. I told Howard I needed to think about it. He said of course. He also said very carefully that option 3 was available to me, regardless of what else happened in the divorce, that it was not a threat and not a weapon, but a disclosure that I was within my rights and arguably my obligations to make, and that the timing of that disclosure was something I had reasonable discretion over. He said he wanted me to understand that before I decided anything. I spent 4 days thinking. During those 4 days, Nicole texted me twice, once to ask if I had retained an attorney, once to ask if I was doing okay. I responded to both, briefly and honestly. I was doing okay. I had an attorney, her attorney and mine would be in touch. On the 5th day, I called Howard and told him to make the call to Meridian's board. Howard made the call on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Meridian's general counsel had convened an emergency session with the 2 independent directors. By Tuesday evening, Nicole had received a formal communication from the firm's legal team informing her that a conflict of interest had been flagged involving a significant investor and a senior equity holding executive, and that she was identified as the executive in question. She was asked to refrain from discussing the matter with colleagues until the governance review was complete. She called me at 7:18 p.m. I was having dinner at my brother's apartment. I had moved out of the house the previous week, quietly and without drama, the way I have always preferred to do difficult things. I answered on the 3rd ring. She said, "Nathan, what is going on at Meridian?" Her voice was controlled, but had a quality underneath the control that I had heard only a few times in our marriage, a quality of genuine uncertainty, which was not something Nicole experienced or displayed often. I said, "I think your firm's general counsel is probably better positioned to explain the governance piece than I am." She said, "Nathan, what did you do?" I said, "I disclosed something I should have disclosed a long time ago. I'm sorry it's coming out this way." She said, "What did you disclose?" I said, "I own 40% of Meridian, Nicole. I have since before you were hired there. I invested through my fund's blind vehicle before you ever heard of the company. I should have told you when you were recruited. I didn't. That was wrong, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But it's relevant now, and my attorney and I believed the board needed to know." There was a silence on her end of the line that was different from every other silence in 11 years of knowing her. It was the silence of someone recalibrating an enormous amount of information very quickly. Finally, she said, "How long have you known I didn't know?" I said, "Since the day you told me about the job offer." Another silence. Then, "And you never said anything?" I said, "No." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because when you first told me, I thought it wasn't relevant." and then it became relevant, and too much time had passed, and I couldn't find the right moment. And then you handed me divorce papers on a Thursday afternoon, and I understood that the right moment was never going to arrive on its own." She did not respond to that. After a moment, she said she needed to go. I said I understood. She hung up. I sat at my brother's kitchen table and ate the rest of my dinner and did not feel triumphant. I felt something I am still trying to find the right word for, something between resolution and loss, as though the answer to a very long question had finally arrived, and the answer was exactly as complicated as the question had always been. The governance review took 11 days. Meridian's general counsel and independent directors ultimately determined that no breach of fiduciary duty had occurred. I had made a passive investment through a fully anonymized fund structure. I had had no operational involvement in the firm, and there was no evidence that my ownership had influenced Nicole's hiring, promotion, or compensation in any way. This conclusion was correct because it was true. What the review did surface was the existence of my ownership, which would now need to be managed through the firm's normal related party disclosure protocols going forward. The divorce proceedings were affected by the disclosure in ways that Howard had anticipated and that I want to describe accurately. Nicole's equity in Meridian, the equity she had received as part of her VP compensation, was now subject to a closer examination because the relationship between my investment and her equity created a structural complexity that both legal teams needed to assess. Howard's position was that my investment predated the marriage and was a separate asset. Nicole's attorney's position was that the equity she had received and the career trajectory that had produced it had been enabled in part by a marital asset, my investment, and that this should be reflected in the settlement. This is where I made a decision that I think defines more of who I am than the disclosure itself did. I called Howard and told him I did not want to use the investment as leverage in the settlement. I was willing to acknowledge in the settlement documentation that my investment had been a factor in the ecosystem that had allowed Nicole's career to develop as it had. Not because I was legally required to, but because it was true, and because 11 years of marriage deserved an honest accounting, even at its end. Nicole's equity would be hers. My investment would be mine. The marital estate would be divided fairly, without either of us trying to use the other's professional circumstances as a weapon. Howard expressed some skepticism about this approach. I told him it was what I wanted. He drafted accordingly. The settlement was reached 4 months after the Thursday with the papers. It was, by the accounts of both legal teams, one of the more straightforward high-asset divorces either had handled in recent years, not because it was simple, but because neither party was trying to destroy the other. Nicole's attorney told Howard at one point during the mediation that she had rarely seen a case where both parties seemed more committed to ending with their integrity intact. I found that observation both gratifying and sad because it described something that had been true of us for a long time and that had not, in the end, been enough. Nicole and I spoke once privately, about 6 weeks after the settlement was signed. She called on a Sunday evening. We talked for about 40 minutes, more honest than most of the conversations we had had in the last 2 years of the marriage. She said she wished I had told her about the investment. I said I knew. She said it would have changed things. I said I believed her. She said, "Would it have changed your decision not to tell me?" I thought about that for a long time before I answered. Then I said, "Probably not. I thought I was protecting something. I was wrong about what needed protecting." She said she understood that. I believed her too. She is still at Meridian. She is good at what she does, and the firm is lucky to have her. And I mean both of those things without irony or qualification. My investment in the firm is now fully disclosed in the firm's related party documentation. I am still a passive investor. We have no operational reason to interact. I do not believe we will. I have thought a great deal in the year since any of this happened about the difference between the things we withhold to protect others and the things we withhold to protect ourselves. I told myself for 3 years that not disclosing the investment was about Nicole, about not complicating her success, about not making her feel that her achievements were somehow less than fully her own. There is some truth in that, but there is also truth in this. I didn't tell her because telling her would have required a conversation that might have changed things, and I was, at some level, afraid of what it might change. That fear was its own kind of dishonesty. It lived in the marriage the way all unspoken things live in a marriage, quietly and with consequences that don't announce themselves until something else makes them visible. I resigned from the fund 6 months after the divorce was finalized, not because of anything related to the divorce, or not primarily. I'd been considering the move for 2 years, had been tired of the work in the specific way that work exhausts you when you have been doing it long enough to understand all of its limits. I'm doing something else now, smaller and slower and more my own, in a space that doesn't require me to be anonymous about anything. It suits me better. I think it probably always would have. The 40th percentile of a strategy consulting firm is a strange thing to have had, and stranger to have had quietly for 3 years, while the woman you were married to built her career inside its walls. I do not know what the right thing to do with that information would have been. At every step, I know what I did, and I know what I would do differently, and I know that the difference between those two things is the kind of knowledge that only arrives after the fact, and that costs more to acquire than any investment I have ever made. If there is something you know that the person you are building a life with doesn't know, something that intersects with their life, their work, their sense of what they have built and why, I am asking you plainly, tell them. Not because the law requires it, not because the governance protocols require it, because the relationship requires it, and because the right moment is the one you make, not the one that arrives when there are no other options left.